I'm Shannon, and today we're going to talk all about facing.
You will learn 3 different facing styles in this tutorial. The first will be an all-in-one facing, which is a beautiful way to finish your neckline and armholes for a sleeveless garment. Then we're going to look at a hem facing and how it can make the bottom of your garments look great. And finally, we're going to finish it off with a simple neckline facing tutorial. So let's get started. To begin, we're going to start with our all-in-one facing. I'm going to be using the brunch blouse pattern from Patterns for Pirates. You'll want to go ahead and print out your front and back bodice pieces. Let's start with the front of our brunch blouse and a pencil and a ruler. We're going to start at the underarm seam and make a little mark at 2 inches down. We're going to continue working around the armhole edge, making little marks at 2 inches down. Once we've done that, we're going to move over to the center front and make our marks 2 inches down at the neckline. We're going to continue making those little marks 2 inches down and work our way towards one another. Once we get close together, we're going to bridge this gap with a nice soft curve. We want this curve to be up high enough so that it's not covering the chest area, but it's also going to connect the two areas with a nice soft line. Next, take some tracing paper and lie it on top of the facing that you just created. Now you're going to take that line and trace over that gentle soft curve you created, and then finish by tracing the actual pattern piece. So you're going to do the center front neckline here. Then you're going to move over to that underarm seam. You're going to go up along the armhole edge, tracing the original pattern, the shoulder seam line, and finally the neckline. Make sure that you label your center front of your pattern as a fold line so that you know to cut this piece on the fold. Then cut out your pattern piece. Now we're going to do the same thing for the back. We're going to begin at the underarm, mark down 2 inches. Then we're going to move to the center back neckline and mark down 2 inches. And we're going to work our way towards each other. Once we get to this kind of center area of that shoulder seam, we're going to have to turn and make this soft curve again. You'll just want to bridge these two areas together. Make sure you do this part in pencil. That way you can erase any of these areas that you may mark up at first. But go ahead and create your nice soft line, trace it, and cut out this pattern piece as well. One thing to note here, the brunch blouse uses a center back seam. So in my facing piece, I'm going to need to cut 2 of these from my inner facing and 2 of these from my facing lining pieces, and I need to sew them with a center back seam line. If you don't want to have a center back seam in your facing, make sure you watch my neckline facing tutorial where I'll show you how you can remove this for your pattern piece. Now it's time to construct the garment. Go ahead and cut out your front and back of your fabric and your front and back facing piece from fabric as well as from inner facing using the pattern pieces you just created. Now for this tutorial, we're going to do this a little bit different than what you may have done in the past. You are not going to fuse your inner facing to your pattern pieces just yet. We're going to be using this to create a soft finished edge without having to use a serger or a machine stitch. So now we're going to put this together and we're going to do it a little different. To begin, we're only going to be taking our set of facing pieces, and once we've sewn that center back seam together, we're going to lie them together right sides and match up the shoulder seams. By matching up the shoulder seams, we're going to go ahead and sew those at a 1/2 inch across the shoulders, and then we're going to repeat this on our facing pieces. So now take your interfacing pieces and match those right sides together at the shoulder. You'll know that your interfacing has a wrong side and a right side by feeling the rough side. The rough side is the glue. That's going to be considered the wrong side for this tutorial. So match up the smooth sides and sew them together at the shoulders. Now you're going to go ahead and take this piece that you've sewn as well as the facing that you've sewn, and line them up right sides together so that smooth side of the interfacing is touching the right side of the facing fabric. Once you've lined those up, we're going to be sewing along the top and bottom curved edges of our facing pieces. We're going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we're going to start at one underarm and work our way across those curves to the other underarm along the front. And then we're going to go to the underarm seam in the back and work our way across those curves to the other underarm seam. Now grade your seam allowance and clip into the curves on both the top and the bottom sides. Now take your pattern piece and turn it right sides out so that the inner facing and the facing are touching each other with the sticky side towards the back of the facing. Once you have this all neatly lined up, you're going to take it to your ironing board and you're going to be pressing that fusing to the back of the facing. And this is the magic how you're going to create this nice, clean, finished edge. Take your piece that you've sewn together at the shoulder seams and the center back seam for your brunch blouse and lie it right sides up. Take the facing piece that you've created, matching it right sides together, and stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the neckline. Once you've done that, grade and clip your seam allowance curves as usual. Make sure you are understitching your neckline. This means putting the seam allowance towards the facing edge and using a 1/8 inch seam allowance to stitch that down all the way around the neckline. This will prevent it from rolling out while you are wearing it. When you're finished, it should look like this from the correct side. You will make sure that the facing is rolling towards the under part of the bodice and is not being seen when you're wearing it. So now we're going to turn our focus to completing the armhole edges. To do this, you're going to go ahead and take your pattern piece and lay it out flat. Now you're going to start at one of your underarms, and with the right side of the top facing you, you're going to start rolling one of the armhole edges towards the other with a tight roll. You're going to work your way all the way across until you get to the other shoulder seam. Once you're at the other shoulder seam, take the fabric from the bodice and the fabric from the facing and wrap it around the rolled up fabric you just created. You're going to want to match your shoulder seam here and put in a pin, and then go ahead and continue pinning all the way around this armhole edge, matching right sides of the fabric. Then take it to your machine and do a 1/4 inch stitch, making sure you are not catching any of that fabric that you rolled up. After sewing, clip and grade your seam allowances around this armhole curve edge, and then you're going to gently reach inside to the fabric and pull your fabric to the right sides through this hole. Make sure you're pulling gently on this and not tugging it apart while you go. Here is your one completed armhole. It should be looking nice and smooth, but we want to go ahead and repeat that understitching process on our underarms along both sides. So press your seam allowance to your facing and go ahead and understitch down the arm. Then we're going to roll that finished side once we've done the understitching to the other side and repeat the whole process again. And here's what the understitching looks like from the wrong side. It should be a nice clean stitch. Now it's time to finish up that side seam. Here you can see how we've created this beautiful all-in-one facing, and that bottom edge is nice and clean because of the method that we used with our inner facing. So now we just need to finish the side seam. To do that, open up your side seam edges, match your facing to each other and the bodice to each other at the fabric on the underarm, and stitch using your seam allowance. And now you have a beautiful all-in-one facing. From the right side, you should not be able to see any of that facing that we installed. It should roll nice and neat underneath using the understitching to hold it down. You can tack at the underarms just to make sure that it doesn't shift, but from the inside, here is the look at the final piece. This is a beautiful way to finish your garments. Now let's create our hem facing. A hem facing is a great way to finish the bottom of any garment. I'm going to be using the brunch blouse pattern to show you how to create this finished edge. Again, you need your front and back bodice pieces from the pattern, a ruler, and a pencil. Start at the outside edge, work your way from the bottom, measure up 2 inches, and make a little mark. We're going to continue doing these 2-inch marks all the way across the bottom until we get to that center back seam line. Then we're going to connect our curves using a nice soft line. Now it's time to trace our pattern piece. Take your tracing paper, lie it on top, and go ahead and first begin tracing that center back line. This is where you will mark that it is on the fold, and then you're going to follow the line that you just created, as well as the outside side seam line from the original pattern and the original hem. This is now going to be your front facing piece. Mark the fold line so that you know to cut this piece on the fold of your fabric. Repeat this steps for your back piece as well. Once you've done that, you'll want to cut out a piece on the fold for the back, a piece on the fold for the front, as well as interfacing from both of those facing pieces. While you can choose to leave interfacing off for a flowier look, it is nice to give it a little bit of weight and body to the garment to hold it down, so I'm going to add it for this tutorial. Once you've fused your interfacing to your facing pieces, you're going to want to sew your side seams. And now we need to finish the top edge of our facing so that when we fold it in to our garment, it will fit. If you accidentally sew the bottom edge of your facing and finish that one off, when you go to flip it in, it's not going to fit. Don't ask me how I know this. So finish off that top edge with a serger or machine stitch of your choice. Then lay out your top, which should already be constructed up until the hemline, and take your facing piece, which has been finished around that top narrower edge. The side seams have been sewn together, and now you're going to want to mark quarter points. You should have your center back, your side seams, and your center fronts marked on both the pattern and the bodice pieces and the facing. Go ahead and match those and stitch them right sides together. You'll notice here that you're going to be sliding the facing piece right on top of the bodice piece so that that narrower edge is along the top and the 2 raw edges are touching. Go ahead and sew this with the hem allowance in your pattern. For this one, mine is a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to stitch all the way around with my 1/2 inch seam allowance now. After it's been sewn, you're going to clip and grade your seam allowance as we've done before, and then we're going to take it over to our ironing board and press our seam allowance towards the facing side. Once you're at your ironing board, you want to go ahead and take that seam allowance and you want to press it towards the facing side of your fabric. Once you've done that, take it back to your machine and now understitch at 1/8 of an inch away on the facing side of the garment. Now it's time to fold that facing in towards the wrong side. It should go ahead and fit in here nice and flat because you finished that narrower side of that facing piece. And so you want to take your iron and press that in well so that it lays nice and flat all the way around. Hold it down with pins, and then you're going to choose to top stitch it in your preferred method. You can see here I just chose to edge stitch right along my serged finished for my clean finished hemline. And now your hem facing is complete. The last facing style we're going to look at today is a neckline facing. So once again, I'm going to be using the brunch blouse. Here I did it in a knit fabric for just a casual pajama top. So you're going to need your front and back pattern pieces, a ruler, and something to mark with again. So now I'm going to show you how to remove that center back seam line if you don't want to have a center back seam. So what you're first going to do is, just like we've done before, we're going to mark 2 inches down, and this time we're going to work our way all the way around the neckline up until that shoulder seam. So even at the shoulder seam, we're going to mark out that 2 inches. Once we've done that, we're going to connect that line to make our nice smooth curve for our facing piece. But here's where it's going to differ. Once we've traced that off, we're going to have to remove that excess seam allowance to get rid of that seam line in our facing. So we're going to go ahead and line up our tracing paper on top of this piece and begin tracing off our facing just like we've done in the past. Take your tracing paper and lie it on top. First, trace your shoulder line of the pattern. Trace that facing line that you just created, and then go ahead and trace the original neckline of the pattern as well as that center back seam line. This is where we're going to have to change it up on our paper pattern piece. So now take your ruler and move it over 1/2 an inch from that center back seam line and mark a new line. When you cut out your pattern piece, make sure that you mark where the fold will be and X out this area that we're now going to cut off. By doing this, we no longer will need to put in that center back seam to match our brunch blouse. We're now going to repeat this process for the front of the brunch blouse, measuring 2 inches down from that center front neckline. And again, working around, marking a dot at 2 inches down, and this time only going around the neckline until you get all the way up to the shoulder seam. Once you've placed dots at the 2-inch mark all the way around, you're going to connect those with a soft curve as you've done in the past. Now take your tracing paper and it's time to trace off the front facing piece you just created. Go ahead and trace along the facing curve that you just created with those 2-inch marks, along the shoulder seam, the original neckline, as well as the center front line. Don't forget to write in the word fold at that center fold line so that you'll know where to cut your pattern pieces on the fold. Make sure if you're going to add interfacing to your knit garment, you use a knit interfacing which also has stretch. For my pattern, I'm not going to be adding interfacing because this is a simple pajama top and I didn't want any kind of structure to it. So instead, I'm just cutting out both my front and back facing pieces from my fabric on the fold line. Place your facing pieces right sides together and stitch them with your 1/2 inch seam allowance at the shoulder seam. Once you've done that, go around your outside edge and finish it off with the finishing of your choice. Here I just used a simple serged edge. Once you've finished your facing, you want to take your top that you should have already sewn together at the center back seam as well as the shoulder seams, and we're going to be laying it right sides up. Now take your facing piece and lie it down on top of your top pattern, right sides together, matching up your shoulder seam. Again, remember we got rid of that center back seam line, so our back facing does not have any seams in the pattern. Go ahead and pin around this edge, then sew with your seam allowance around the neckline, and now take it to your iron and press that seam allowance towards the facing side of the garment. Finally, finish up with some understitching and then press your new facing in towards the wrong side of your garment. By using that understitching, it should naturally fold in and hold itself down so that it is not seen from the front of the garment. Now you can choose to finish it any way you'd like. For mine, I'm just going to do a simple long straight stitch right here along this serged edge. You simply could tack down at the shoulder seams if you really want to keep this totally invisible from the front side of your garment. But for mine, since it's a casual top, I'm going to go ahead and just do my edge stitching here. Then finish sewing your top per the pattern instructions, and here's what mine looks like from the inside and from the outside.
Thank you so much for joining me today while we learned all about facings. If you need more help or you have other questions about sewing, make sure you check out the P4P University blog post for lots more helpful information. Until next time, happy sewing!